Hello, my name is Megan, and I am going to be talking about Brazil today. So we'll start with the history of Brazil. The history, kind of as we know it, begins with the European colonization of Brazil. Of course, there were indigenous people that lived on the whole South American continent before Europeans came over and colonized the area. But for our purposes, we're going to begin with the exploration and colonization. So the European exploration of Brazil began during Portugal's efforts to expand its colonies to Asia and Africa. Eventually, Portuguese and Spanish colonization did finally happen in the 16th century, although it was kind of a slow go. I think Brazil, the people who were colonizing the area had a hard time figuring out what was the best natural resource to access in the area. Finally, they did discover gold as well as diamonds, and that caused the economy to really take off, and there to be a huge influx of immigrants and people who were wanting to kind of access this new land with new resources. So what led to the eventual independence and government as we know it of Brazil today is kind of a funny story. The royal family of Portugal fled Napoleon, and they ended up going to Brazil to live and kind of ruled Portugal from afar, kind of in exile in Brazil. So eventually, after staying there for many years, the king of Portugal decided that he needed to go back and rule his country there locally. So he did. He went back. He left his son, Pedro the First, behind, and Pedro the First eventually, very shortly after, declared independence. It was kind of a bloodless coup between father and son. That happened in 1824. And eventually, it was declared a republic by another coup, which overthrew the monarchy. So the monarchy didn't last very long. So at that point, it was an oligarchy. It was ruled by a very few elite people. So it definitely was not your ideal democratic republic at that point. So going up into the post-colonial time, there were several rounds of regimes that kind of that ruled up until the 30s, and the 30s were kind of marked by a period of fascism, very much influenced by the fascism that was kind of occupying Europe at the time. There was a lot of instability after World War II. Brazil was very much trying to find their identity, find the best way to run the country up until this point. There was the first effective democracy put into place in 1945, but there was also a period of military rule shortly after that. So it really has just kind of been a lot of turmoil in trying to figure out the best form of government up until this time. So the culture of Brazil is very rich. It's very diverse. And people there are very much Catholic. A large portion of the population do consider themselves Catholic. I think what Brazil is most known for, what people think about when they first think about Brazil, is the Brazilian Carnival. That is the most popular holiday in Brazil. It takes place right before Lent, almost kind of what people do here in like a Fat Tuesday. So it's just like a huge party, a huge celebration with lots of dancing and music, costumes, very elaborate, very colorful. It really is just kind of like what makes up a lot of what makes up their culture, because Brazilian people very much value dance and music. They're known particularly for samba music. The Brazilian culture is also a huge emphasis is placed on beauty, like physical beauty. There are more plastic surgeons per capita than anywhere else in the world, interestingly. And physical appearance to Brazilian people is really a mark of social status. So the Brazilian culture is also very well known for its diversity. Historically, Brazil has been a very diverse country. In general, Brazilians trace their origins back to Europeans, indigenous people, Africans, and East Asians. They're very much known for their ethnic and racial syncretism. And historically, Brazil has experienced rapid population growth, and now today, Brazil is the 6th most populated country in the world. So, moving on to the political system in Brazil. So the government operates under a federal presidential representative democratic republic. It's very much what the U.S. looks like on paper. It's a multi-party system with 3 branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial. It's a multi-party system with 26 states under the federal government, and they all have their own governments. So yeah, it looks a lot like the U.S. on paper. However, Brazil has really experienced a great deal of relative instability through its history. It's been through 7 constitutions since its independence in 1824. And they kind of just cycle through liberal and conservative ideologies. Liberal being kind of all about internationalism and expanding the economy to like a global status, and then conservative nationalism and protectionism. So that also sounds kind of familiar. So historically, Brazilian politics have also just been really wrought with corruption. They're really known for particularly several just particular scandals that have gone on, probably the most well-known one being Operation Car Wash, which really expands through a lot of different countries and rises through the ranks of very high-level politics. And there was even a Brazilian president who was impeached over the ordeal. It's actually still under investigation, so it's kind of an ongoing scandal. The current president is President Jair Bolsonaro. He is known for his conservative roots and populist sympathies. His sayings are Brazil first and Brazil above everything, God above everyone. He supports less government intervention in the economy, and he's also kind of been said to kind of reek of fascism and authoritarianism. He kind of comes out admiring Brazil's history with military dictatorship. And his relationship with President Trump has been kind of on the news in recent history. And there's definitely some parallels to be drawn between the two presidents. So the economic development of Brazil, kind of going from colonization until now, really began with mercantilism in the colonial era, where they exported sugar, gold, diamonds, and coffee, kind of just to make money for their mother country. In the 1960s and 70s, they experienced rapid growth, modernization, and industrialization. Moving into the 70s and 80s, Brazil actually imposed an import substitution, and this seemed to work at first in kind of keeping that growth going, but it actually ended up leaving the country with a myriad of problems. Then in 1973, during the oil crisis, when OPEC imposed an oil embargo, things began to go downhill and Brazil began to hold a large trade deficit. So that more or less led to the financial crisis of the 1990s. This was thought to be caused by a large amount of foreign debt. The inflation and unemployment skyrocketed. The country cycled through several regimes, each with a new idea about how to handle the crisis. The plan that eventually seemed to help the economy recover was Plano Real, and that was implemented in 1994. So fast forward to 2001, economist Jim O'Neill came up with the BRIC model, and being Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So Brazil was predicted to be one of the largest raw material suppliers in the world, and one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Jim O'Neill suggested that people invest in Brazil and the other BRIC countries. The interesting thing is, since 2001, a lot has happened. And a lot of people have lost faith in the BRIC model, but the concept has kind of survived. And the 2018 BRICS summit was held in Brazil. So yeah, what eventually ended up happening was there was another recession. I mean, there was a global recession in 2014, and Brazil was certainly hit hard. Their economic crisis was paired with a political crisis and the impeachment of their president, Dilma Rousseff, in the Operation Car Wash investigation. This really highlighted Brazil's dependency on the exportation of commodities. So China, one of the biggest purchasers of these natural resources, experienced a slowdown in their economy, along with the rest of the world during this time. So the budget deficit of Brazil and the high unemployment, this led to a budget deficit and high unemployment, and also eventually led to a reduced global credit rating. So this was just devastating for the Brazilian economy. And I thought that these pictures of The Economist title pages really said it all. It was really interesting to look at how everybody was very excited about Brazil, investing in Brazil, until Brazil fell. And people, even to this day, are not sure that they're going to quite recover. In 2017, their economy did begin to recover, but it's a very slow recovery. They've almost stagnated. It's just like a very small buildup, kind of like 1 percentage point at a time. So today, Brazil does find itself as the 9th largest economy in the world, and there's an estimated $2.1 trillion worth of natural resources to be found there. But it does remain one of the most closed countries in the world, and there's a great deal of wealth inequality. In 2016, Forbes ranked Brazil as having the 12th largest number of billionaires in the world. But in 2017, Brazil was also the 3rd most unequal country in Latin America. 5% of Brazilians held as much wealth as the remaining 95%. So extreme poverty also increased by 11% that year. So while there is a great deal of economic success, there's also a large amount of poverty and a huge amount of a huge gap between the two, which is not usually a very good indicator of general economic success. So moving on to the key companies and organizations in the country. Well, first of all, I'll go back to that slide. The major industries and markets are manufacturing, banking, petroleum, agriculture. The same economist that came up with the BRICS model, Jim O'Neill, actually says that Brazil perhaps relies a little bit too much on their commodities. But their top exports are soybeans, iron ore, crude petroleum, raw sugar, and automobiles. So the main companies would be Petrobras, oil and gas, Vale for mining, and then there are several banking firms that are in Brazil. So the future expectations and kind of analytics that are kind of forecasting for Brazil, most would predict that Brazil would continue to grow, but very slowly. Inflation will most likely continue to kind of ebb and flow. Brazil will most likely continue to grow as an economy, but maybe not to the same level that was originally predicted. And as I said, Jim O'Neill says that it probably has to do with just their reliance upon commodities, which are really just very fickle things to rely on. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the coming years. These are my sources. Thank you so much for listening. It has been very interesting to study Brazil and see kind of the role that they play on a global scale, and also just been interesting to see kind of the way that their economy has grown and